Good evening and good morning, because we are here half located in Bremen, Germany, and half located in Santa Barbara, California, where we have now 9 a.m. in the morning. And it's wonderful to have you all here. I warmly invite you and welcome you to our discussion. And we had 27 persons registered. So at the moment we are 21, maybe we will wait some more minutes. But maybe during that time I may give you already some first hints. We had this all already in the email, but maybe again, just the technical hints. The microphones are muted to avoid any background noise, and yes, and I see the most of you already have turned off the video also. And we would ask you to only switch on the video and audio when you want to ask a question. You also may click the checkbox hide non-video participants, so that you don't see all these little black rectangles, the placeholder images, but just the speakers. And we hope that technically everything will run smoothly. Also, again, the announcement that this event will be recorded and made available online for streaming or download. So if you ask a question and don't want to be seen in the recorded file, please let us know. Let us know, yes. So I hope most of you are now here, and I want to welcome you again and say I'm very happy to have this event, because due to Corona, we canceled all our research colloquium on East European history. And this is the only talk we have now in cooperation with the lecture series of the research area in Bremen, Worlds of Contradictions. And at the same time, I'm quite upset because actually Adrienne Edgar was supposed to be right now here in Bremen. Because
I'm even more upset.
Yeah, this is close to her second homeland, Oldenburg, where she stayed for a year when she was in high school. Yes, so that is just the background. I'm very happy we have this second event with Worlds of Contradictions this summer term. And once again, about the structure of our event. So we all know that Zoom is quite exhausting, so we decided to have just a short presentation of 20 minutes by Adrienne, followed by 2 comments of 10 minutes each. And then we decided to have the questions live, that means via audio and video, not like the last time in the chat. So I will call up those who want to ask a question, and I would kindly ask you to type your name in the chat to all. So in the chat I may see who wants to ask a question, and then we will have 3 rounds of questions after the talks. And again, an important remark, we always encourage students to ask the questions and let them pose their questions first. So please, all students who are present, feel cordially invited to let me know that you want to ask a question. And I promise we will finish after a maximum of 90 minutes, because on Zoom that is already a lot of time. Okay, so before handing over to Adrienne, let me briefly introduce our 3 speakers. Adrienne Edgar is Associate Professor of Modern Russian and Central Asian History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She holds a BA in Russian from Oberlin College and an MA in International Affairs and Middle East Studies from Columbia University, and a PhD in Russian history from Berkeley. She has received several research grants and fellows, of which I will name only the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, because that brought her to Berlin and to Heidelberg. so she knows Germany very well and then speaks quite well German. Adrienne's first book, Tribal Nation, The Making of Soviet Turkmenistan, was published by Princeton University Press in 2004. And she has just completed her second monograph titled Intermarriage and the Friendship of Peoples, Ethnic Mixing in Soviet Central Asia. Adrienne is also co-editor of Intermarriage from Central Europe to Central Asia, Mixed Families in the Age of Extremes, forthcoming this summer with University of Nebraska Press. And so she's an expert on the topic of today's evening about racism and interethnic marriages in the Soviet Union. So our first discussant is Maren Röger. She is assistant professor for East European and German history at the University of Augsburg, which is Bavaria for those who are here from the US. She holds a master's degree in applied cultural sciences from the University of Lüneburg, which is quite close to Bremen, and a PhD in history from the University of Gießen. In Augsburg, she's also head of an institute dedicated to the historical region of Bukowina. Her most recent book is about sexual policies and everyday life of the occupiers in World War II Poland, with the title War Relations, Intimacy, Violence and Prostitution in Occupied Poland, 1939 to 1945, published in German with Fischer in 2015. And she also worked about intermarriage between Germans and East Europeans and contributed to Adrienne's volume on mixed families in the age of extremes. Our second discussant is Yasemin Karakaşoğlu. She's the head of the research group on intercultural education at the Department for the Science in Education at the University of Bremen. She holds a master's degree in Turkology, German literature and political science from the University of Hamburg and a PhD in education from the University of Duisburg-Essen. From 2011 to 2017, she has been vice president or vice rector for internationality and diversity at the University of Bremen, and she was influential in developing and implementing the intercultural, inclusive, and language-sensitive teacher training university program. She's co-author of Muslimization, Othering Experiences of Students in Academic Teacher Programs, published in an edited volume with Routledge in 2016, and forthcoming in 2020, this year, is a co-edited volume, Regimes of Belonging, Schools and Migrations with Springer Press. So as you may have noticed, our idea was to have one discussant from more or less the same field, East European history, maybe also adding from her research on interethnic marriages in the GDR, and to have another discussant from a completely different discipline with a different regional expertise, to have a different view on the Soviet topic. So I'm very excited about our panel. Thank you all for joining us, and I'm looking forward to the three contributions. And please, Adrienne, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Susanne. Thanks for inviting me. Of course, I would rather be in Bremen with you than sitting in my office at home, but nevertheless, I'm really delighted that there is a way to do the talk despite the global pandemic. So I'm grateful to you and to the two discussants and to everyone who has joined us today. So my talk is about racial thinking and mixed marriage in the Soviet Union. And so I want to start out just by mentioning that those of you who are in the audience who are historians of the Soviet Union may know that race is a relatively new topic in our field, and that its relevance is still contested. Until quite recently, Western historians used to accept at face value the Soviet claims that race did not exist in the Soviet Union, and that therefore racism also did not exist in the Soviet Union. The multi-ethnic Soviet state categorized its citizens by nationality rather than race. The official Soviet view, dating back to Lenin and Stalin, was that nationality was cultural and historical, but it was not racial. It did not have anything to do with common descent or blood. The term race had no legal meaning in the Soviet Union, in contrast to many other countries that we know in the 20th century. And the term itself was avoided throughout most of the Soviet period. Yet I will argue that a covert racialization of the discourse and practice of nationality took place in the final decades of the Soviet Union's existence. And there were several factors that contributed to this, some of which have been identified by other historians such as Ron Suney. The institutionalization of national territorial republics, which led people to view their nationalities, their titular nationality, as kind of eternal and immortal, always on this territory. The revival of the discipline of genetics in the 1960s, which had been banned under Stalin, led to renewed discussions about the role of the biological in human communities, and that the idea that human communities were biological, genetic entities, not just social and historical. Increasingly, the characteristics of Soviet nationalities came to be seen as genetically determined and immutable. Some historians now argue that racial categories were very much present in the Soviet Union, even if they were not talked about in the same way as in other countries, and if they didn't precisely, and even though they didn't precisely correspond to racial categories in other racially based states, such as the United States, for example. So in my talk today, I'll examine racial thinking in the Soviet Union through the lens of mixed marriage, by which I mean, my definition here is a marriage between a man and a woman belonging to different officially defined Soviet nationalities. There were, of course, other ways of conceptualizing nationality within the population, but this was the official Soviet definition. I'll focus first briefly on the official scholarly discourse about mixed marriage, because it was a big topic among social scientists in the period I'm looking at. And then I'll turn to recollections and experiences of members of mixed families themselves. My conclusions here are drawn from my recently completed book on mixed marriage in the Soviet Union, which Susanne so kindly mentioned, and it uses Soviet documents and publications, as well as oral history interviews and interviews with Soviet-era scholars to examine these questions. So, one of the most striking things about intermarriage was that it was enthusiastically embraced by the communist state. Those of you who have studied mixed marriage in other periods and places will know that this is not always the case. Soviet officials and the scholarly establishment celebrated ethnic intermarriage as proof of the friendship of nations, of the Soviet peoples, and perhaps even more importantly, as a sign of the imminent emergence of a single unified Soviet people. Along with celebrating their own enlightened attitude toward mixed marriage, Soviet officials and scholars like to criticize other countries that did not have such an enlightened attitude, most notably the Cold War rival, the United States, in which some of you may know that bans on mixed marriage were only declared unconstitutional in 1967 by the Supreme Court. So there were many places during much of the Cold War where people could not legally marry a person of a different race. Soviet support for intermarriage was strikingly consistent over virtually the entire history of the USSR. However, the way Soviet officials and scholars spoke about intermarriage changed over time. In the first decade of Bolshevik rule, some Soviet researchers, mostly carryovers from the Tsarist period, still subscribed to conceptions of racial hierarchy and racial pathology that were then prevalent in Western Europe and the United States. They maintained that racial mixing led to degeneracy, and they argued for eugenic measures to prevent the reproduction of unfit individuals and groups. In the course of the Stalinist Cultural Revolution of 1928 to 1932, these views were repudiated, and a new official Soviet discourse on race was crystallized. So-called bourgeois ideas about immutable racial traits were abandoned, since they did not jibe with Soviet notions about the plasticity of human nature. The official Soviet position was that culture was not innate and that there were no inferior and superior races. In the 1930s, Soviet physical anthropologists attacked the notion that racial mixing was degenerate and harmful. They conducted studies designed to show that actually mixed race individuals were healthier and stronger and more productive than other people. They maintained that racial mixing was not only positive, but inevitable as society advanced. Moreover, the very idea that there was any influence at all of the biological in human life human social life was roundly rejected. To biologize, I'm saying the word wrong, sorry, to biologize human society, or to engage in biological determinism, as they called it, became unforgivable ideological deviations during the Stalin period. And in fact, for several decades under Stalin, under high Stalinism, roughly from the mid-30s until Stalin's death in 1953, discussion of ethnic and racial differences was entirely suppressed. It was considered an anachronism, while entire scholarly fields such as genetics, eugenics, and sociology were banned as bourgeois. It wasn't until the 1960s that ethnic mixing, once again, emerged as an important topic for Soviet social scientists and nationality theorists. This coincided with the revival of some of the fields that had been banned, most notably sociology, ethnography. Well, ethnography hadn't been banned, but it had been downgraded, and genetics, and a new surge of interest in nationalities and interethnic relations. Soviet ethnographers, led by the new director of the Institute of Ethnography at the Academy of Sciences, a man named Julian Bromley, adopted a new term, the ethnos, to describe human communities. This was an originally Greek term, and in the Soviet context, it meant a human community that maintained its identity, its distinct identity over centuries or even millennia. The debates about the ethnos in the 1960s and the 1970s brought back an issue that had seemingly been resolved in the 1930s, namely the role of the biological and the biological versus the social in human culture. Is the ethnic group or the nationality a biological organism, a cultural and historical entity, or is it both? Is ethnic mixing primarily a biological, biogenetic process, or is it a cultural and social process, or is it both? These were the kinds of issues that were debated. The Stalinist revolution had put an end to these debates, since any link at all between the biological and the social in human life was rejected. However, the theme returned with a vengeance in the 60s, and debate about the role of biology and genetics in human life rumbled through Soviet science in the 60s and the 70s into the 80s, with important implications for the study of mixed marriages. The concept of ethnos itself encouraged a primordialist view of human ethnic communities. While Bromley generally stressed that the ethnos was a historical construct, even he wavered on the nature of ethnos. He sometimes called it biological, he sometimes called it social, sometimes he called it biosocial, so he wasn't quite sure. Bromley himself gave a big boost to the study of intermarriage with a major article he published in 1969, that was called Ethnos and Endogamy. Endogamy, of course, is marriage within the group, an anthropological term, which appeared in the flagship journal Sovietskaya Ethnografia, Soviet Ethnography. In this essay, Bromley made a theoretical case for the importance of mixed marriage in creating the Soviet people and leading to the merging of Soviet nations. He argued that in the socialist period, as well as the capitalist period, the tendency was for ethnic groups to merge with each other, consolidate. And since the defining feature of an ethnos was endogamy, or keeping marriage within the group, when groups started to intermarry with each other, this was a sign that they were about to merge into a single group. And so with lots of this happening, in other words, if lots of intermarriage was happening in the Soviet Union, groups were going to merge into each other and eventually produce a single Soviet people. Bromley's article was sharply criticized by some older historians, kind of Stalinist leftovers, because of its emphasis on the biological. There was a public discussion of his article at the Institute of Ethnography in February 1970 that was designed, actually it was kind of a political thing designed to push Bromley out. There were people very unhappy with him for this reason as well as others. And at this meeting, Bromley doubled down on the biological and genetic aspects of his argument. He said endogamy creates a genetic barrier for the ethnos, that every population has a tendency to increase the homogeneity of its gene pool and become a race. So intermarriage is a way of avoiding this. In the end, Bromley's ideas on the ethnos and on intermarriage did prevail. He remained director of the Institute, and his essay and his support provided the impetus for a rapid expansion of this field of study. Ethnos theory and Bromley's ideas on ethnos and endogamy provided an extremely fertile new field, and lots of Soviet ethnographers, not only in Russia, but in all the republics, ran out and started doing studies everywhere about intermarriage in different regions, different republics, and so forth. And if you ever look at Sovietskaya Ethnografia, the journal, you will see lots and lots of articles on intermarriage. This was actually one of the reasons I originally became interested in this topic. I thought, why are they all writing about intermarriage? So that's kind of my very brief summary. It's actually a whole chapter in my recently completed book about what happened with the official discourse and study of intermarriage. I'd like to turn now to whether and how this increasingly essentialist and biological view of nationality was reflected in the language and perceptions of ordinary Soviet citizens. And this part of my book and this part of my talk draws on oral history interviews with members of mixed families in Kazakhstan and Tajikistan. My talk today mostly focused on Kazakhstan just for simplicity's sake, and that's just how it worked out with the stuff I selected for this talk. So anyway, these interviews have shown that Soviet citizens often spoke and understood of nationality in racialized ways, even though they almost never used the term race. Even members of mixed families who might have been expected to have a more nuanced and critical understanding of identity, being on the margins of nationality themselves, tended to describe the characteristics of national and ethnic groups as innate and immutable, and to accept the implicit existence of ethnic hierarchies, both within and outside of the Soviet Union. This, to me, is racialized thinking, even if they don't use the term race. I'd like to focus on 3 areas where racial ideas emerged with particular prominence in my oral history research. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about official nationality, sort of the national identity of Soviet citizens and the discrepancy between official and subjective identity that was characteristic among the offspring of mixed marriages in many cases. Second, I'd like to talk about the bestowing of first names on mixed children. And third, I'd like to talk about language, especially the use of Russian language in mixed families. Okay, so first of all, nationality, official nationality. Some of you may know that in the Soviet Union, everyone had an official nationality. It was marked in their passport. And if you weren't mixed, you simply had the nationality of your parents. 2 Russian parents, you were Russian. If you were mixed, you had a Russian and an Uzbek parent. You had to decide which one when you were 16 and you went to the passport office. You had to make a formal declaration that I'm Uzbek or I'm Russian. You couldn't be both. You couldn't be neither. Those were the choices. Now, often the subjective sense of identity, nationality of these young people failed to coincide with the identity that they declared in their passport. This problem had a gender dimension, especially in the case of mixed marriages uniting a Russian or other European woman with an Asian or Muslim man. In Muslim families in Central Asia, the children were generally expected to take the father's identity, the father's nationality, but in many cases, they were often primarily Russian-speaking and identified more with their mother's Russian culture. Let me give an example. I'm going to give a few quotes now from my oral history research. A woman who I will call her Maria Iskanderova, born 1960, child of a Russian mother and an Azerbaijani father. Maria resembled her father physically. In other words, she looked more like an Azerbaijani. She bore his patronymic and last name. In her childhood, the discrepancy between the external markers of nationality, in her case, and her subjective feelings of identity brought unwelcome comments from strangers. Here's a quote from Maria. I really got sick of the attention that was always directed toward me in particular. I look like my father. I don't resemble my mother at all. And so everybody would go, oh, is that your mom? Ah, but you don't look like a Russian. Who's your father and how and what and so forth. Somehow these questions were not very pleasant. So these kind of intrusive questioning of who we are about your identity is something that many mixed people complain about in the Soviet Union. And not just the Soviet Union, I should add. So, because she closely resembled her father, Maria noted resignedly that she never could have declared her nationality to be Russian. People simply would not have believed it. She felt that it would have made her a laughingstock since she was dark-haired, dark-eyed, had a Muslim last name. She felt that she could not take Russian nationality, even though that was what her subjective identity was. Similarly, a woman I will call Nadia Kim, who was mixed Ukrainian and Korean ethnicity, always considered herself more Ukrainian than Korean, having spent much of her childhood in Ukraine with her grandmother. But she nevertheless declared Korean nationality for her passport. And according to her mother, Nadia did this because of her physical appearance. She felt that she looked more Korean than Ukrainian, and She said to her mother, "Mama, how can I write that I'm Ukrainian when I look like this? What kind of Ukrainian am I?" Similar considerations of phenotype and identity entered into discussions of naming mixed children. When bestowing a first name on a child, mixed couples placed high value on something that I have called in my book name matching. Now, this meant on the one hand that people thought a child should have a first name, patronymic, and last name that all matched. You shouldn't have a Russian first name and a Tajik patronymic and last name, for example. But it also, even more importantly, meant that the child's first name should match the child's looks. A woman named her pseudonym Mayra Akhmetova, a Kazakh woman in a mixed marriage, explained that it would be awkward for a child who looked Kazakh to have a classically Russian name. And here is a quote from her. "Well, because the kids don't look Russian. They have, so to speak, Kazakh blood, which after all dominates, just like African blood. They will look awkward if you name them something like that." It's the end of quote. A woman named Anastasia Martsevich, an ethnically mixed young woman who grew up in Moscow, mixed Kazakh and Russian. She agreed that someone who is obviously part Kazakh should not have a Russian name, especially not a classically Russian name like her own. It was one of the Tsar's daughters, of course, Anastasia. Half Kazakh and half Russian, she felt uncomfortable with this name, which has Nastya as its diminutive, when she was visibly not fully Russian. Anastasia wished she had been named something neutral like Dina or Dana, as she said, easier on the ear and simpler for interethnic interaction. Such a name also would have gone better with her looks. And she commented, "Nastya, Nastya, because of my appearance, in Kazakhstan, everyone says, you must be making that up." So no one believed she was actually named Nastya. Marina Abdurrahmanova, a mixed Kazakh and Russian woman married to a Kazakh man, tried to name her daughters based on what they looked like as newborns. She told me that her first daughter came out looking Kazakh, so they gave her a Kazakh name, Asel, which means honey in Kazakh. But the second daughter came out not looking like a Kazakh, so they gave her what they considered an international name, Aya, which actually is a name in a lot of different languages. This belief in name matching reflects a unitary view of identity in which external appearance, name, passport nationality, and language should all ideally be in conformity. Now, finally, let me turn to the question of language in mixed families. Most intermarried couples wanted their children to speak perfect Russian, so they spoke exclusively Russian at home. Interestingly, it was most often the Central Asian fathers who insisted on speaking Russian, perhaps because they knew how important it was for success in career in the Soviet Union. But for children who did not look Russian, I'll put that in quotes, speaking perfect Russian could provoke a surprised reaction from others or pose identity dilemmas for the speaker. Ruslan Isayev, the son of a mixed Ukrainian mother and a Kazakh father, recalled that his parents always spoke only in Russian, and he said the reason was they did not want him to speak Russian with a foreign accent. Apparently, it was not enough to have a functional or even an excellent knowledge of Russian if you grew up as a mixed person in Central Asia. Parents wanted their children to speak it perfectly without an accent. Clearly, they believed that their children would go further in Soviet society if they were perceived as Russian native speakers rather than as Central Asians who had learned Russian as a second language. And yet, if they had the wrong phenotype, the wrong looks, they might not be perceived as native speakers no matter how perfect their Russian skills. And here again, I will refer to Maria Iskanderova, the mixed Azeri-Russian woman I mentioned a moment ago. She frequently encountered the assumption based on her name and appearance that she would speak broken or accented Russian. I would start speaking and people would say, "Oh, you speak without an accent. What nationality are you?" "Well, for goodness sake, why should I speak with an accent?" she said. Russian was her native and her only language. And yet a perfect knowledge of Russian, normally a source of pride, could be a source of shame and in certain circumstances. Many of my ethnically mixed respondents expressed deep regret about their failure to learn their father's languages, be it Tajik, Kazakh, Uzbek, and Azerbaijani. Moreover, it was common knowledge that speaking Russian perfectly did not make one a Russian. One of my respondents, a Kazakh woman married to a Russian man, recalled an incident in a train where she and her sister were traveling with two military men sharing a compartment, which happened in the Soviet era. If those of you who ever traveled on a train in the Soviet era will know that that's the case. And when the girls stepped out of the compartment for a moment, they overheard the two men talking about them. And the younger man said, "Who are they? They speak Russian so well." And the older man said they could only be from Kazakhstan. Only Kazakhs speak Russian without an accent. The woman, the Kazakh woman, Saltanat, was shocked by these words. It had never occurred to her to think it odd that she and her sisters spoke Russian without an accent. Russian was their native language. And she said, I will remember this observation for the rest of my life. Of course I speak Russian without an accent. If I speak on the phone, no one would ever know that I'm Kazakh. I explain myself in proper and literary Russian. Saltanat was upset not only at being taken for a foreigner whose Russian language skills were surprising, but also at the implication that Kazakhs had betrayed their true identity by exchanging their native language for Russian. This implied a kind of inauthenticity. The problem with being Kazakh and speaking perfect Russian was that one would never be mistaken for an ethnic Russian or fully accepted as such, because you don't look like a Russian or have a Russian name. As David Layton has written, a Ukrainian who spoke Russian may or may not have been considered a complete outsider, but a Kazakh who spoke perfect Russian continued to face residual prejudice and suspicion as a possible fifth columnist. Thus, speaking perfect Russian and being able to pass for Russian on the phone for Saltanat was a bit like the problem of sounding white, which has been described by some African Americans. It did not change her fundamental identity, and it raised doubts about her authenticity as a Kazakh. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that I've tried to show in this brief talk today the ways in which racial thinking in the late Soviet period insinuated themselves into everyday conversations and decisions about mundane issues like, or maybe perhaps not so mundane, issues as varied as naming children, preferring one language to another, and deciding which identity to use in your passport. Examples from these life histories show the extent to which national culture in the Soviet Union had come to be seen as something innate, biological, and immutable. In this worldview, an individual's cultural identity was no longer malleable, learned, or even a matter of choice, as Soviet scholars and officials had insisted in the 20s and 30s. Even if nationality had not exactly become race, Soviet thinking about nationality had become racialized. This had important implications for the post-Soviet era, when overtly racist ideas, an obsession with genetic purity of the nation, and opposition to ethnic intermarriage appeared in former Soviet republics from Russia to Tajikistan. Thank you very much. I look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. It's always a strange moment when you want now to applaud, and there's not really means to do it, but yes, we cannot do via the reaction. At least you can see it, if not hear it. And we move straight forward with the first discussant, which is Maren Röger. Please, Maren. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Adrienne, for your interesting talk, and thank you also for inviting me. Mixed marriages are nowadays such a common phenomenon that we tend to oversee their potential to interest and irritate politics, society, the public, and individuals in different ways. This is still valid for the present, but much more in historical perspectives. Depending now on century, decade, and region, it differed, of course, extremely which liaisons were seen by which persons as a transgression, as an overstepping of the societal order. Those lines were drawn for centuries, we sometimes forget this, rather along societal classes, nobleman versus simple man, religions, and confessions. In the 19th century then, nationalist thinking was added, later racist thinking, hence the idea of what was actually mixed or shall not be mixed changed dramatically in the course of the centuries. Adrienne just introduced us to her highly interesting research on mixed marriage in the Soviet Union and its connection to racial thinking. And she reminded us, and here I'm repeating her introducing arguments who were really for me very interesting, of the very fact that the term race had no legal meaning and was even avoided throughout most of the Soviet period. So it is then really astonishing and once again worth noticing that intermarriage was not only enhanced, but as Adrienne puts it, and I like those words very much, enthusiastically embraced by the Soviet state in all of the decades of its existence. It was ascribed the potential, this was the wording of the official discourse, to integrate the empire. The more endogamy, the better it proved the merging of Soviet nations. And I think this finding, once again, is it's in itself a truly relevant finding, and I would say makes the Soviet Union an outstanding country at this time. Adrienne reminded us of the very fact that if you look in a comparative view on some of the other countries, at this time you have different policies regarding intermarriage, and you just said that in the US, the negative projection screen during the Cold War, so there were other racial policies still at stake. And just because it also speaks later on to my argument or my question about continuity, I would like to introduce a brief look on Germany after 1945, because it's also interesting what happens there. I won't delve too much in the German history of the racial laws during the Third Reich, you all know this. But what is interesting, what happens after 1945, is that of course every ban of marriage, of intermarriage was lifted, but still there were other groups who were now not welcome to be, as I call it, because intermarriage speaks to this, to get to the heart of the nation. And I try now to share with you something. Can you see this? No? Ah, okay. I try to share with you my screen. Can you see this? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, yes.
So, yeah, perfect.
Now we see it. Wonderful.
So we are now in the 50s and 60s of the Federal Republic of Germany. And what happens now is, of course, there was no ban of intermarriage, but still the Federal Republic of Germany sponsored some information centers for those who are interested in intermarriage issues. And those information centers and also the publications were mainly exclusively led by the churches in Germany. And who they now found as a new other or as a new boogeyman who should not be married in the Federal Republic were now the people, as you can read here, of Muslim faith. And this is quite an interesting phenomenon, because when you look at the immigration numbers in the 50s or the early 60s, it's not a relevant group in society who you should warn, let's say, all the women about. But there are some really interesting materials to see that when it's about intermarriage, I would argue, it's always about the question who is allowed by the main society or by some groups of society to come into the heart of the nation. And yeah, these materials, I will not comment to this, but one point is about who is allowed to join, let's say, the center, of the nation. And the other point, what I want to make, is about continuity, because interestingly, when I did some research about intermarriage of the Germans with the Eastern European and the racialization of this discourse, what then appeared to me is that in the German Empire at the end of the 19th century, they were more opposed against interreligious marriages with Muslim people, and this came back, interestingly, after 1945. So I would say there's a long line of continuity everywhere to consider, and this is later on one of my main points or questions to Adrienne. So this was a I just shortly wanted to show this with you because it's kind of bizarre also. But now coming back to Adrienne's talk. Adrienne Edgar did in a second step compare the official discourse with oral history interviews, with Erfahrungsgeschichte, as we would call it in German. This is highly interesting, and I'm really enthusiastic about these kind of mixed methodology approaches who combine the discourse with the Erfahrungsgeschichte. Your examples in the paper you sent us, Adrienne, however, made me think about 3 different points I want to ask you about. First, the relation between state discourse and history of experience, to be more precise, between a reintroduction of racial thinking in the 1960s and the stories the people told. Because when I listened to the individual voices in the paper, I could not help thinking, on the one hand, about longer lines of continuity. I am no specialist about this, but I was immediately thinking about 19th century politics in Russian Empire, the politics of Russification. This policy, as far as I read the recent studies, had its limits, but it still contained ideas of supremacy or superiority of the Russian people in comparison to other ethnic, religious, or linguistic groups in the empire. So here I'm interested in your view about those longer traditions or continuities in the thinking, and if and how they can be seen in perceptions of selves and others, or to put it in other words, where the racial wordings in the individual stories connected to the changes in official discourse since the 1960s, or, and this might be a little provocative, or did they just never disappear from biologist thinking that gained its power since the 19th century? So, and this is a little bit contrafactual, yeah. Would interview conducted before these reintroductions of genetic and racial thought sound so much different? And maybe to ask less contrafactual, I was just wondering if you know of earlier studies analyzing the question of intermarriage on the basis of oral history interview. So is there something, could you trace an involvement of the narrations over time? And to come back to this question, where's the place of biologist wording? When I conducted some interviews with persons who were born due to sexual relations between Poles and Germans during wartime, I was astonished how often and how easily Polish persons or people living in Poland really use this kind of racialized vocabulary to explain their character. So due to my German blood, I heard very often, I always love to have everything proper in life and in order, etc., etc. So my argument would be that this kind of racialist thinking and vocabulary is so widespread in European society that I'm really interested, was it really overcome in the Soviet society because it was banned from the official discourse since the 20s and then reintroduced? So here I would like to hear some of your arguments about this. Second, closely connected with this, you argue that this obsession with genetic purity of the nation and the opposition to ethnic intermarriage that appeared in former Soviet republics from Russia to Tajikistan in the post-Soviet time is to be seen somehow as a continuity of this racialization before. And I was wondering, where do you place the other way around? How does the actual political situation and the way the people from those republics are seen in the center of Russia, how would you say, does this influence the narrations the people gave you in 2000, I think 10 were conducted your interviews? So where was the political situation of the time you were interviewing, and how did this reflect in the oral history narrations you got back then? And then thirdly, and still I'm no specialist here, I was wondering, where is the specific place of intermarriage with Tajik, Tatar, Kazakh, Azerbaijani persons in your research design? The felt and ascribed otherness seem to be closely and maybe only linked to physical appearance. And how would you say is the situation different regarding couples and offspring who resembled themselves physically, but were still seen, according to your definition, as mixed marriages? And to deepen this question or give it another spin, where would you locate here a conflict of center and periphery? Because when I read, for example, the quote of Sultanate, who was shocked about the ignorance of Russian military men, I was wondering if you can strengthen the argument to not only think about the notion of race, but especially in regard to the territory of the Soviet Union, to think about center and periphery. So the man from the center just did not know about the quality of Russian language education in its periphery. Is ignorance racism? I ask a little bit provocative. So this is, of course, with a little bit of provocation. And then I was further thinking about the questions of center and periphery, because the other way around, I heard a quest for belonging in the narrations, to belong to the hegemonial society. Your examples reminded me also about narrations by immigrants. When I was, for example, reading these examples about parents wishing their kids for a perfect mastering of the language, I immediately thought about a lot of immigration stories when you read from the Eastern European migrants who came in the 1980s to Germany and who are often in sociological terms described as being hyper-integrationist. You have a lot of stories when the immigrants stop to speak with their children, their native language, their mother tongue, with this attempt to get to the center of the society and not to be identified as migrants any longer. And here, and this is just a question I do not know, this was not just the bottom-up process back then, but experts at this time warned against the bilingual upbringing, claiming it would confuse the children. So therefore, I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit on the debate by linguists, kindergarten professionals, etc., about bi or multilinguality in the Soviet Union at this time. So to sum up, my main questions were, where would you locate the history of biologists thinking in your research? So where is the longer line of continuity? And where is the specific place of this kind of intermarriage you were looking at in comparison, let's say, to the whole territory of the Soviet Union? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Maren. Thank you very much. I just ended your screen sharing. I hope this is okay. And we move right on to Yasemin as our second discussant. Please, Yasemin. Your microphone is still off.
Sorry for this. Okay. Yes, thank you, Susanne, for inviting me to comment on Adrienne's highly interesting paper, which provided me with new insights into historical and societal contexts I haven't been much familiar with until now. And I'll do my very best to point at those aspects I found especially inspiring, and I will include some few questions and will end up with some humble suggestions. Adrienne aims to talk about how race manifested itself in thinking and talking about mixed marriages with respect to the societal context of the former Soviet Union. And she starts with mentioning that race is a relatively new topic in the field of history of the Soviet Union, where it was common sense to believe in the absence of race and racism in the USSR. I would add, at least in the official narrative. Please allow me this incidental remark. This sounds quite similar to the neglect of racism and the necessity to fight it both structurally and as an individual attitude in the former German Democratic Republic. From the German recent history, we learned that this neglect was one of the key accelerators for the rise of xenophobic and racist attacks of the early 1990s. It was the era when the two German states united after the collapse of the blocs and the rise in numbers of refugees and migrants seeking to settle in Germany was in both parts of Germany abused to foster fears of losing an ethnically understood German identity. But coming back to Adrienne's paper, looking at international literature on mixed families and their offspring, it can be stated that the challenge in all national contexts, that they challenge in all national contexts the notion of a cultural, ethnic, and racial homogeneity. Thus, these families' experiences of being racialized, of exclusion and othering, are a litmus test, an indicator to societal routines in dealing with hybridity and uncertainty of cultural identities. And here I would like to quote from Rodriguez, Garcia, and Friedman. They put it this way in 2006: the more ethnically, racially, or religiously segmented the context is, the more visible the mixed couple will be, representing a union of the groups thought to be incompatible. And I continue, their relationship becomes a social and even a political act, especially during times of greater social upheaval. The findings which are presented here in Adrienne's paper give important hints to what this means for the case of the former Soviet Union, in my view. I learned from the presentation that in the former Soviet Union, each nationality was distinguished by shared cultural and historical roots. An understanding of nationality I would equate with ethnicity, which is not far away from racial understandings of essentialistic links, as the expression of cultural and historical roots point at something that only can be inherited, not acquired. So in my view, this understanding of nationality is already quite close to racial thinking, even though the term race hasn't been used officially. Adrienne points to the essentialism underlying the idea of national identities in her expression right at the beginning of her speech, when she stresses the Soviet institutionalization of national identities within national territorial republics led over time to these nations being seen in increasingly primordial ways. Adrienne presents an interesting historical overview on the development of changing political approaches towards mixed marriages and Soviet social scientists' approaches to the research on mixed marriages. It becomes, for me, obvious that the official approval of mixed marriages has been for a longer period of time used as a political propaganda weapon towards the political counterpower, USA, meant to show Soviet Union supremacy and civilized approach to this social phenomenon. But this official declaration wasn't followed by administrative regulations that would allow to live a hybrid or mixed identity. Thus, the approach resembles more a propaganda trick than a political confession. Under these circumstances, it doesn't seem so irritating that, on the other hand, being Russian in the perception of society was equated with ethnic markers that would indicate ethnic pureness, like a specific outward appearance, phenotype. Whatever this is about, from the quotes I understood, there is no need to specify, as both the interviewer and the narrator are supposed to share common ideas on that. Name and language proficiency in Russian also mentioned, meaning speaking Russian without any foreign accent. We gain insight into the power of societal norms and shared attitudes on Russianness that don't leave any space for hybrid, mixed, self-determined identities. If the official policy of acknowledging mixed marriages as a sign of overcoming nationalistic ideas is not followed by a policy that allows for mixed national identities, it opens up the space for the prevalence of racist categories and the ideas of supremacy. But the origin of the prevalence of racist categories, this is a point I miss in the paper should also be analyzed with respect to power relations between nations in the former Soviet Union that are shaped by colonial hierarchies deriving from the Russian Empire's supremacy in Asia. This would be my thesis. I would assume that at least a part of the racist attitudes towards people belonging to the so-called Asian nations has its origin in decades of Russian hegemony in the region. In a clear-cut hierarchical order along the lines of ethnically defined nations, there is no space left to become real or pure Russian, as this is the privilege of those who possess phenotype, language skills, and names of Russians by birth and nature. There seems to be no space for the development of an individual cultural identity as Russian beyond the narrow borders of what is supposed to be real ethnically proved Russian. To sum it up, officially mixed marriages as part of the Soviet propaganda are welcomed, mixed cultural identities are not. Thus, for me, it seems as if by implementing communism as unifying political and societal ideology that replaces all national, ethnic, or religious affiliations, the Soviet Union, as the successor of the Russian Empire, didn't succeed in implementing a transnational identity of the Soviet citizen. The Soviet Union still held on to the division of ethnic groups into different nations, with the Russian unquestioned being the leading one. Racialized talks on ethnicities and cultures occur in Adrienne's material in 3 ways that give insight how this failure of the Soviet Union to implement a transnational identity influenced the struggle of the offspring of mixed marriages to find a place in society with their specific hybrid identity. Firstly, as a felt discrepancy between official and subjective identity among the offspring of mixed marriages. Secondly, in the search for first names that fit the outward appearance of mixed children in order not to cause confusion about the national identity of the child in the eye of a third party. And thirdly, in the search for a proper use of language in mixed families that wouldn't hinder the child's future success in school and society. In all 3 aspects, there seems to be no way out of the vicious circle that pure Russianness cannot be acquired but only inherited. Thus, any attempt to sound real Russian or to be named like real Russians can be jeopardized by the outward appearance that doesn't fit to the notion of Russianness. Like it becomes obvious in the case of Saltanat when she says the problem with being Kazakh and speaking perfect Russian was that one would never be mistaken for an ethnic Russian or fully accepted as such. I'd like to finish my comment with some references and questions that came into my mind while I was reading Adrienne's paper and now listening to it. One is about the methodological approach, the other about the use of the term and concept of race by the researcher. And here I have to apologize that as someone coming from social science and educational science, might have a different understanding of the methodological approach than it has maybe to be in history, in the science of history. So the methodological aspect there, I would ask, the method of oral history has been used to trace how racial thinking and talking was embedded in the narrations of members from mixed families. I know that oral history, different from social science approaches to qualitative interviews I'm more familiar with, to confess, treats narrations as authentic documentations on how everyday life is experienced and perceived by individuals with the aim to understand history right from the grassroots. I guess that the historian's approach to this kind of interview material takes also into account that these narrations are an interpretation of reality, a reconstruction. But, and please forgive me if I might mix inappropriately oral history and narration analysis with social science, in some parts of the analysis of the quotations, I miss the reconstruction part. For instance, when terms like true Russian or Asian used by the narrators are equated with analytical categories of races, or when categories like Muslim families, father's nationality, Russian speaking, mother's culture are, in my opinion, unquestioned presented as if they were in contradiction to each other. So a second point relates to how race as a category is used in the paper with respect to the concept of race that is reflected in both the Soviet Union's policy towards nationalities and in the societal approaches to ethnic divides. I would recommend a reference to Homi Bhabha's Cultural Racism. I guess this could be fruitful to identify the potential for racialization in the concept of nationalities in the former Soviet Union. From my own research in educational studies, I would also take into account the concept of structural versus individual racism to distinguish between the structures that enable or even support implementation of racial thinking and the individual ideological attitudes expressed in racialized talks over belonging or not to a national entity. And this would help to identify the policy-based structural preconditions and framework that enable societies to distinguish between those who ethnically or racially belong to the big us and the other. I end up with these ideas and would like to say again, thank you, Adrienne, for your really enriching paper. I'm very much looking forward to our further discussion.
Thank you very much, Yasemin. And again, applause, only via the icon, but at least. So we decided that we will open up right now the floor for questions. And Adrienne may react to the comments a little bit later. I ask you to put your name in the chat if you want to ask a question. There are so far yes, wonderful. Michael Lehmann wants to ask a question. So the first question goes to you, please.
Okay. So, sorry, I'm weirdly unfamiliar with Zoom because we always use other technology. Do you see me? No, but you can hear me?
We hear you, yes, yeah.
Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you very much for all your input and your presentation. First of all, Adrienne, I think my question relates a little bit to both Maren's and Yasemin Karakaşoğlu's questions, because I would wonder how what you said about the racialization of nationality in the late Soviet Union, how that would relate then to the role of diversity in the Soviet Union, where nationality continues to be celebrated, national culture celebrated, put on TV with folk dance and national literatures. And I mean, of course, there are certain hierarchies, with Pushkin being the epitome of not only Russian but Soviet culture, and kind of the marker of marking that you're a cultured person. Like if you're Kulturnost is marked by speaking Russian without an accent, by knowing Pushkin, Shakespeare, etc., etc. So I would wonder if you could relate your argument to the role of diversity as something very much celebrated in official discourse and also in everyday practice. And my second question would be how this then relates to Sovietness, if there is anything, not necessarily in the term of everything is Soviet as in the official vision of emerged people, but as a socially lived, addressed practice of being Tajik and Soviet at the same time, or Russian and Soviet at the same time. How does that interrelate? And maybe third, if I may, if this becomes more and more racialized and similar to other discourses in the rest of the world, what may stay specifically Soviet? Are those continuities, or what are the specifics still relevant despite this development?
Okay, thank you very much. And we have no more questions at the moment. I once again would like to encourage students to ask their questions. But yes, you can just type your name in the chat, or you can raise your hand when you click on the participant or Teilnehmer icon. Then you find in the lower right corner the 3 dots, and there you can raise your hand. But just make yourself somehow visible. And but maybe for the moment, it's a lot to answer already for Adrienne. Adrienne, would you like to have the first round of answering?
Yes. Can you hear me now? Am I okay? I'm unmuted. Good. So thank you both, Yasemin and Maren, for your excellent comments. This is so interesting, and I'm worried that in the time that remains, I won't have a chance to do justice to all of them, but I will do my best. And thank you, Micah. I'm sorry I can't see you, but hello. It's been a long time, and thank you for your question. Excellent questions as well. So I guess maybe I'll start with what Micah asked about how this story of racialization relates to the diversity in the late Soviet Union, the celebration of multi-ethnicity, as you put it, in discourse and everyday practice. And you know, I think the way it relates is that there's a constant tension between them. You know, while yes, it is possible to be Tajik and Soviet at the same time, and many people did it. At the same time, there are tensions between this sort of increasingly essentialist primordial view of the nation, which, as Yasemin rightly pointed out, within the concept of nationality, that is already, you know, there are already aspects, you know, of what we might consider race. Anytime there's an element of dissent, and you know, in a category, it you know, has that tendency to become race, I guess. There's a constant, I see a constant tension that grows stronger in the late Soviet period between increasingly essentialized, primordialized views of nationality, and at the same time, this concept of a broader, you know, welcoming of multi-ethnicity. And I think the promotion, you mentioned Sovietness, how it relates to Sovietness. I think the promotion of Sovietness, which you know, as you know, was very big in the late Soviet period, promotion of a Soviet identity, a Soviet people. This is kind of an attempt to square the circle, you know, and create something that everyone could identify with. And in the view of social scientists, eventually there was going to be this thing in the distant future called a Soviet people. But I think that I sort of see this celebration, this official celebration of diversity, and this belief in a Soviet people, which was not only official, many people believed in it and still do believe in it, but it coexists with this kind of almost covert, you know, racialization and primordialization of nationality. It's a tension, and you know, that is never resolved. That is never resolved in the Soviet Union. Both of these ideas exist at the same time. I guess maybe I'll move on to talk about some of Maren's questions. I was very interested in the question of continuity. This is something I've been thinking about a lot, whether this, so seeing these similarities between the way people talk about, you know, their life histories and the kind of racialization that was taking place in the, you know, in the scholarship. You know, I don't relate these directly or see a causal relationship between them. I think it's highly likely, you know, and I think I'm kind of arguing this in my book, but maybe I need to make the argument even stronger, that I think this, you know, as you say, Maren, racial ideas are so strong in, you know, in Europe and in the world, you know, in the late 19th, 20th centuries, that even if you don't use the word race, you still end up talking about race, you know, and even if, as in the Soviet Union, you come up with an internationalist ideology, an ideology of anti-racism, a state discourse that celebrates multi-ethnicity, discourse that welcomes, you know, mixed marriage and so forth, even if you come up with all of that, these older, you know, kind of cultural frameworks still exist. And so I think what you described, you know, that yes, you know, I mean, these racial ideas were there in the scholarship even as late as the early 1930s, you know, and obviously they also existed in people's heads. Now, the Soviet Union tried to create a multi-ethnic society and claim that all nations were equal and so forth. But as Yasemin pointed out, these colonial relationships, in which Russians were the, you know, were the dominant nation, those ideas too existed and continued to exist. I mean, these ideas, that's why in the Soviet Union, Lenin and Stalin were constantly trying to combat against great Russian chauvinism. You know, you may remember in the early Soviet period, because Russians were always showing so-called great Russian chauvinism, i.e., you know, prejudice and superiority toward Muslims and people of other ethnicities. So I think that there is a continuity there with longer traditions, with longer cultural frameworks. And the question of whether earlier, you know, about the way people talk in interviews and whether they would have spoken differently had these interviews taken place before the 1960s. Unfortunately, we don't know, you know, because nobody could do oral history in the Soviet Union before 1991, and people. Unfortunately, people left behind, the people I'm talking to left behind few documents and memoirs and letters about their lives. The official discourse of intermarriage was almost entirely celebratory. When you read the articles, it's all about how, you know, Russian women come in and completely remake these Muslim villages, and they introduce them to cabbages and, you know, and lace tablecloths and get along with their in-laws perfectly. And you know it's not true, you know, when you read this, and so because that's just not how the world is. So, but the only way, as imperfect as it is, you know, and Yasemin, I would say to you that, you know, historians, we do have various ways of thinking about oral history, about memory, about how, you know, the historical events that have taken place since these events influence the way people talk about the past. Obviously, there are all kinds of ways to talk about this, to try to account for this in our work, but fundamentally, you know, I don't have any evidence of how people would have talked about this, say, in the 1940s, the 1950s. Not really. And you have to kind of try to get at it in the, you know, in the types of, in the way you analyze, the way you interpret, you know, what they say, as well as if there is any, you know, corroborating evidence, looking for that. But it's very difficult in the Soviet case. It just wasn't there, especially since these disciplines were virtually, I mean, ethnographic, sociological research, everything was completely impossible in the Soviet Union prior, you know, between, say, the early 30s and the 1960s. So, so there just isn't, you know, there just isn't any of this kind of evidence. But as for the question of, and again, the question of the continuity of these ideas, I also think that this tension between the biological and the social was there in the 19th century as well. When you read things about 19th century physical anthropology, for example, Marina Mogilner's book, Homo Imperi, you see some of the same ideas there, both racialized ideas of race, but you also see anticipation of some of these ideas of welcoming diversity. You see the Russian Empire celebrated for its diversity. You actually see intermarriage even in the 19th century spoken positively. Spoken of positively by some scholars. So all of these ideas were already there. But the Soviet regime took the ideas of internationalism, of welcoming intermarriage, of national equality, made that official ideology. And, you know, many people did accept these ideas, but the other ideas never completely went away, of course. I don't know if that helps answer some of these questions. Are there any other questions, Susanne, so we can let someone else ask, or should I go on and answer more?
At the moment, no more questions, but let me ask if there is someone else. Yes, Elias Angel, is that right? No. Someone else to ask a question? Yes, Elias, please.
Sorry, there was some little Zoom confusion going on there. So I have a question. Thank you, Adrienne. Thank you, Maren, and thank you, Yasemin, for your fascinating talks and also the examples you brought. I do have several questions. I try to limit myself. I believe it was Jeff Zahadio who tried to analyze a category of blackness, where he stretched, well, he somehow underscored that there is in racist thinking in what's now Russia and in the Soviet Union before, that there is terms of very derogative terms of calling somebody black in a mean way and in a racist way, which didn't necessarily relate to, for example, the students coming from African republics studying in Moscow. Those would be rather called Afrikaanse, for example. I think that were the examples he made. What would you think? Is it a problem of the 90s, and doesn't that lead also to a somehow perceived inequality of, let's say, for example, people who consider themselves to be Russians and what they see as an allocation of goods to the Georgian Republic, for example, because they think, well, Georgia gets all the better product, they were sustained better than others, and so on. So could you elaborate on this category of blackness in the Russian language itself? And I have a small question to Yasemin, if I may, because you mentioned the distinction between structural and individual racism. I somehow struggle with this notion to really make a distinction between the two, because it pretty much, for me, as a consequence, has a meaning that you could struggle with both then individually. So there, at one point, you could address institutional or let's say structural racism on the one hand, and so what is first, right? That's basically one thing I'm really struggling with, because when dealing with the two somehow in a polarized way of thinking, that somehow leads to that consequence, I would say. I hope I'm being clear. I'll end here. Thank you again.
Thank you, Elias. So in terms of blackness, so it's a little bit of a complicated issue in the Soviet Union. The Soviets welcomed American blacks, for example, and African students, and rhetorically, again, they condemned racism in the US and elsewhere, and welcomed students and others from, and many African Americans, for example, went to the Soviet Union, finding it, especially in the 30s, while there was still segregation in the United States, they found it a much more congenial place than their homeland. At the same time, racism toward blacks or toward African Americans did not just appear in the 1990s. People I know who were there in the 70s and 80s, African American colleagues of mine experienced incidents of racism and constantly, on an individual level. So, and I think here it relates to what I liked your comparison with the GDR, Yasemin, because the idea that you neglect the existence of racism and therefore you don't deal with it, and therefore it's festering beneath the surface all the time. That's kind of what I see going on here too. I mean, there was racism against African Americans in the Soviet Union. One thing I will say is that in my interviews, one of the most frequent comments I heard was people said, well, I'd let my child marry anyone, but just not an African, or just not a black person. That was a very common, black people were defined as the ultimate other. Maybe they didn't know any black people, and that's why they were able to do that. But nevertheless, there was kind of an extreme racist attitude there where black people were considered lowest on the ladder. And I have to say that since I'm married to a Nigerian American man, when I first started doing my interviews, I would mention that, thinking that this would be a point of commonality with the people I interviewed, but I very quickly realized that if I said that, they might have particular ideas about me or be reluctant to say particular things that they were thinking, and that therefore I just, stopped mentioning it. so in order to not have that influence the interview somehow. But Elias, the other thing though about blackness in the Soviet Union is that people of, you mentioned Georgia, people of Caucasian, people who come from the Soviet South, began to be referred to as blacks in Russia. So the term blacks, when used in Russia about immigrants and so forth, refers to Central Asians and people from the Caucasus, and less so to people of African descent. So I don't know if that answers your question, but should I respond to anything else, Susanne? That there's so much that both Maren and Yasemin said, but I want to give other people a chance to answer questions too. So I'll let you decide as moderator.
Thank you. Maybe Yasemin would like to answer Elias first, and then we look how many minutes are still left. Thank you.
Of course, very briefly, because in the center of our discussion, it's Adrienne's talk, but yes, the division between structural racism and individual racism. I didn't mean that that there is a sharp division between these two concepts or two ways racism occurs or can be evaluated, but structural racism would be a racism which comes with regulations, with laws which affect in the laws and regulations that have the effect of racist divisions. And the law that forces children from a mixed marriage to decide for one nationality, even though this child is supposed to be or considers himself as a mixture of two nationalities that are considered to be equal nationalities in the whole united under the idea of Soviet Union general identity, is, in my perception, or in my interpretation, a part of the structural racism that leads to in power relations where this decision whether you decide for the Russian or for the Kazakh nationality is not really a decision that's open, where both decisions are equally valuable. There you have a structural racism, and that fosters and enables attitudes, racist attitudes that are already there in place. And so there is a link between these two forms of racism, but I think it makes very much sense to not subsumize all expressions of racism as attitudes, but to see where the structure fosters racist attitudes, willingly or not willingly. This is not the main point. Mm-hmm.
Thanks a lot, Yasemin. And we still have 5 minutes, so this is the last call for another question. If there's somebody still willing and brave enough to raise his or her hand. But if there's nobody, oh, Maike, yes, please.
So then I might have figured out Zoom.
Oh, hi, Maike.
Maybe going back to what Yasemin just said about structure. Maybe another point, because I found your examples very interesting, Adrienne, especially about the surprise of the woman that two military persons would assume that a Kazakh would have broken Russian. And as if I understand correctly, you interviewed people being born in the 60s, kind of going into kind of higher education, or kind of going to school and leaving home probably in the 70s and 80s. That's just an assumption.
No.
But I wondered if this turn that you see with the scientific discourse starting from 1970, how much other structural aspects play into that situation where difference is accentuated, celebrated, but then lines of belonging and non-belonging are continually drawn in a situation where affirmative action becomes highly contested in the Soviet Union, meaning that members of non-Slavic and non-Jewish groups would get easier access to higher education, like having affirmative action for universities in Moscow and Leningrad, and therefore the assumption that the Chukchi or the Kazakhs who would study there didn't get their place on equal terms, but were advantaged in a situation where social mobility was highly starkly lowered for the younger generation in general in the Soviet Union. Kind of the social conflict over careers, over place in the society became much more hot, if you want, than several decades before. And how that heightened the assumptions about ethnic differences, where you meet these people that differ from your own background, how that kind of the social aspect plays in. And I mentioned the military situation because I had many instances where the military complains that people from the republics wouldn't be able to speak Russian, learned it in the army to then proceed to higher education in a situation where careers became much more difficult to realize for a younger generation, while the older Brezhnev generation sat like iron behinds in the important places. So there was not much mobility.
Thank you, Mike. Sorry, I promised we will be just in time. We have 2 more minutes. Thanks a lot for the question. And so the last 2 minutes are yours, Adrienne, to answer everything what was left.
Thank you all for your question. Thank you, Micah. I just wanted to say, I think generational change is really important in the story that I'm talking about. And I interviewed people born between the 1920s to the 1980s. So there's really kind of a fairly wide range there. And the generation, you're right, the generation born in the 60s, 70s is quite different from the ones that came before, with regard to language, with regard to how it regards, Sovietness and so forth. And so it's just something I didn't have time to talk about today, but I do have a 400-page book coming out. So anything that I have not addressed today, hopefully will be addressed in that book. I just wanted to say one word about language, that Maren had asked about language and people wanting to belong to mainstream society by speaking Russian and so forth. And I think this is a really, really important point. And you compared it with immigration. And it's funny because in my chapter on language and in the book that I just finished, I sort of compare this 3-generation learning of Russian of mixed families in Central Asia and even some non-mixed families to the 3-generation linguistic assimilation that has been talked about for immigrants to the United States and elsewhere. So yes, I think there are, even though people were living in their own republic, there are some similarities to immigration in immigrants in the desire to kind of merge into a mainstream society. And the only thing I'll say is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, the direction in which people needed to merge became different. People, the values that people had lived with in the Soviet era were turned on their heads, and people had to learn Kazakh instead of Russian and had to adapt to a completely different environment. But that's a different story. I think I have to end.
Cool. Thank you very much, Adrienne. That is wonderful. By the way, I hope you will be able to be here next summer, and then we will repeat this event and have a book presentation, and I hope we will have a glass of wine or beer afterwards, which is impossible right now. Thanks a lot to you. Thanks a lot to Maren and Yasemin. Yeah, just water. Thank you for to all attendees for the questions, and yes, have a nice evening. Stay well, and I hope to see you live next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks so much for coming.
Yeah, and lots of applause.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.